and welcome to the Gallant Few podcast. My name is David Tomlinson, and we're doing a special edition of the Gallant Few podcast. We have invited authors from the football world mostly to tell us about their books and enjoy the talk about football mostly, I think. So with me tonight is Mr. Gary Thacker. Welcome, Gary.
Hi, Dave. Thanks for having me on board, matey. As you say, it's always great talking about football. If you talk about my book as well, that's just a bonus, buddy.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to just give a wee mention to, we just heard before we come on, when we're recording this, Edwin van der Sar has been taken into hospital with cerebral bleeding, and just wish him all the best and his family all the strength they need to get over it. Moving on, Gary. Yeah, sorry. Moving on. Well, tell us something about yourself, Gary.
Yeah, okay. I'm Gary Thacker. I live in Spain. The book we're going to talk about is my 7th book. I didn't start writing until I was about 50-ish. Strangely enough, I worked in lots of industries, and at that stage I was working in the graphic design industry, and I used to do a lot of writing a copy for the adverts and such like. And so I got into blogging from there, and from then progressed into various websites. I've written for lots of websites, and eventually got involved with These Football Times. Now one of the senior leadership team at These Football Times. Came out to live out in Spain 5 years ago. Until last summer, I wrote a regular weekly column for an English language newspaper over here on La Liga. So I've done that, and written for various magazines. I say this is my 7th book. We're going to talk about today. My 8th one, my final book. I'm retired now. Is just with the publishers now. But the book I'm going to talk about today represents probably my greatest love in football, which is Dutch football, particularly Ajax and the great Dutch teams of the early 70s.
Yeah, is it just football you write about, or do you write about other subjects?
No, I'm a great sports fan. I like all sports, but I only write about football. I don't know why it's the honest answer. It's just what I started out doing. It just sort of led me on from there. Each of my books has covered different aspects of football, international game, club game, etc. So yeah, I've written a couple of fiction books as well, a couple of novels, just to try something different, try my hand at something different. But yeah, even the novels they weren't football books, but they were sort of set in football scenes, shall we say. It's what I know best, I suppose.
Okay, well, if you make a list of the books and then send it to me an email, I'll get it put on the bottom of the site here.
I'll do that. Thank you.
Gary, really sort of how did you get into Dutch football? What was your motivation to all of a sudden turn around and think, I'm going to write a book about Dutch football?
That's a great question, Dad. It's a great question. I think it goes back to the sort of early 70s, or what I'd be 12, 13, 14. And at that age, I guess it's the impressionable age where you sort of see things like with music, a certain type of music of that time that sticks with you, and such like. And I remember watching Ajax winning the first European Cup, and I just thought just magnificent the play the way they played, and I picked it from there. Followed them the next 2 or 3 years, and obviously in '74 with the Dutch national team. I mean, the World Cup in '74, they were by far the greatest team never to win a World Cup. I mean, we have a few debates about this on These Football Times, and some people argue for Brazil in '82, but I just think the Dutch were just like beings from another planet, and they were the team that sort of the Ajax club team of the early '70s fed into that. And yeah, I just think the Dutch football at that time, for a small, fairly unadventurous footballing nation, that in 1974, this is a classic thing, this is a classic statement. I got this quote from Dave Winner in his book Brilliant Orange, you'd probably be aware of. I was chatting to Davie kind of to help me with the book, and he's got a quote in Brilliant Orange that In 1974, when the Dutch went to the World Cup finals, they had a World Cup record equivalent to that of Luxembourg. They played in 2 pre-war World Cup final tournaments, and in both of them they'd played 1 game and got beat in both of them. So they hadn't even won a game going into the World Cup in 1974. So, and this is what the Ajax team and to some extent Feyenoord as well, the outstanding players of those clubs had fed into becoming a team that had never won a World Cup game before to becoming everybody's second favourite team in this tournament.
Yeah, well, I've also got a thing about that. The Ajax were for years supposed to be the best academy in the world, really.
Yeah.
But a lot of the players they actually brought in were 16, 17-year-olds that had never been through their academy, and they just sort of split players from Denmark, Scandinavia. They brought in the kind of players, and as I said, they were 16-year-old, never played in their academy, but because they played 1 or 2 years in their academy, they put them down as an academy player. So while they were a really good academy, they did cheat a wee bit on the sort of a summing up of how they did it. It's easy for me to look through internet, YouTube, and find films of Dutch football, find people that talk about Dutch football. It must be really difficult for you when you don't speak any Dutch, and I mean, there are a lot of things translated, but not everything's translated. So how did you manage that?
I mean, we're quite fortunate as much as because the first book I wrote about Dutch football was called Beautiful Bridesmaids Dressed in Orange. It was about the Dutch team 74, 76, 78 World Cup and European Championships. And I got in touch with a few guys from that day that would be one. And all the people I tend to speak to, even the Dutch people, they spoke perfect English. So I was quite lucky in sort of one sort of contact led to another. In this book, I was fortunate to speak to people such as Ruud Krol. And an interview with Ruud Krol, got in touch with Ruud, and I said, would it be okay to chat to you for 10 minutes and ask you a few questions? Yeah. 45 minutes later, we were still going. I mean, such a brilliant guy. Johnny Rep, although I didn't speak to Johnny verbally, we exchanged a few text messages, and more than happy to speak to Ork Cock, who you probably know very well, I'm sure, over there. And then another terrific bloke, very helpful with the book. And I don't know if you've read his biography of Cruyff. It's a brilliant book, and it's Ork's massively. It's a brilliant book. I mean, Cruyff's autobiography called My Turn is fine. It's fine, but Ork's book gives so much more depth to the character, to the footballer, to the man. And Ork, I said, was brilliant. He's kind of sent me a signed copy of Cruyff's biography. And people like Sonny Saloy, I spoke to, Pierre Vermeulen. I mean, there's so many players that was a few past players from that era and just past. Pete Vilchet, who played in the '78 World Cup, he sort of did give me an interview as well. But they all spoke perfect English, so I guess I was lucky in that sort of situation. The only one who was a little bit less totally comfortable was Johnny Rep, and that's why he wanted to do it in sort of text rather than actual verbal, because he wasn't less comfortable in English. But most of the guys, well, all the other guys, I mean, Ruud, for example, Ruud's English is better than mine.
How did you go about that? How did you just phone up, or did you get email? Or
it's a weird thing, Dave. These things don't happen overnight. So I mean, the first Dutch book I wrote was about 2 years ago, and I got some contacts then, and I sort of built from there. And I spoke to various people. Who do you know? Who do you think might be able to speak to me about this or that? And contact. It's like a ladder. One leads to another, and it was. I just sometimes you're talking to these guys, like I say, Ruud, for example. One of my all-time favourite footballers. Before I even spoke, when I was watching him, played in every minute, every second of every game in 2 successive World Cups. And got to the finals both times, captained the Dutch in '78 and was a width of a goalpost, and Rensenbrink hit the post in the last minute of picking up the World Cup. I said, what a player. I mean, fullback, sweeper, centre-back. He could have played in midfield. He had all the skills in the world. And, I'm having a conversation with this guy. It was sort of surreal. I mean, literally surreal to have a conversation with somebody that ilk. And, authors like Dave Winner, as I said, and Ork as well. These are sort of like godlike people to me. But people were so helpful. I mean, when I wrote my previous book, I got in touch with Graham Hunter. What a nice guy. Gave me an interview for about half an hour or so and when he was a kid watching the World Cup in '74, when he was a kid in Scotland. People are so helpful. Once you getting in touch with people is a difficult part, and if it's getting a pathway to them. But most people, in fact, I can't think of anybody who said no when I asked, could I have an interview or just ask you a few questions or ask your opinion or your thoughts about this. I don't think anybody ever said no. People just were so nice, so helpful.
I think one of the things that I sort of, before we got onto your book, one of the things that, see, in the old days, in the 74, 78 period, we couldn't wait for the World Cup to come around. Now there seems to be a thing, England are on, I'm not going to watch England, or the Argentinians, I'm not going to watch them. It wasn't like that back in the days. It was, everybody was, you nearly get left out of school just to watch games of football in the days.
Right, you're absolutely right. I think there were very different times. There was an innocence about football in those days. Going back to 70, I'm old enough to remember. You didn't see it live because it wasn't broadcast live, but I remember the '62 World Cup. Obviously '66 as well. I was 9 when England won the World Cup '66. But in those days, it's in 1970, for example, when it was first one in colour. There's a magic about it, It's like you didn't, 82 used to run home from school to watch the World Cup. But there was an instance, and I think what changed is watching players from another country, watching players from Argentina, Brazil, even African countries. It was new. Nowadays, so many of the players who play for Brazil, play for Argentina, play for Colombia, play for the South American teams, even a lot of the African teams, they play in European football anyway because that's where the money. So a little bit of the magic has gone. So it's not so special anymore as it used to be in the past.
Yeah, I remember my favourite. I always said he was my favourite player in the world. I don't know whether Cruyff would sort of get past him. It was Pelé, and I just loved Pelé when he was a youngster. When he was, I don't think he left Santos. I think he was at the Santos from the start to the finish, I believe.
He went to Galaxy, LA Galaxy. Yeah. No, not LA Galaxy. Yeah. New York Cosmos. Cosmos. Yeah. And without giving too much of a secret away, I mentioned my last book is with the publishers. It has something to do with Pelé in 1970.
Okay. Oh well, I'll look out for that one.
Indeed.
Have you on again to talk about that one? I don't know whether I need to get Colin to get it right, but no problem. I'll talk about Pelé.
Grand.
Okay, I'll get onto your book. The history of it starts with a bit of the history of Ajax. A lot of the book is about Ajax. Were you surprised? Because I was. The amount of sort of English. Most of the people at that time the managers came out of England. I was really shocked at that. I couldn't believe that.
Yeah, well, as well as England, there was an Irish guy and a couple of Scots as well, but British very much. And it's a fascinating little era because we're talking about the early years of the 1900s, and basically English football and British football, Scottish football as well, was seen to be the best football in the world, and so continental clubs wanted to employ British coaches. Because that seemed to be the best football. But the strange thing is, the coaches that went abroad to work in Italy, in Spain, in France, in Switzerland, in Austria, in the Netherlands, were the coaches that were preaching unorthodox approach to football. Now, in those days, British football was very much built it up the park, to a big guy and try, out muscle someone to score. But the coaches who went abroad are people like Jimmy Hogan, who was very much adherent to the Scottish school of football, the short passing, keep control of the ball. And these were the guys who created the European style of football that was by British coaches, but was very much not a British type of football. Jimmy Hogan, for example, he, as well as working in the Netherlands, he coached a club called Dordrecht. Probably you'll know where Dordrecht is. For a while, and he coached the Netherlands national team in one game against Germany. But he also worked in Switzerland. He worked in Austria with Weissel, the Austrian wonder team, and they played a system called the Austrian whirl, which was very much like an interchanging of positions. And you can see the total football development from there. And Jimmy Hogan then went to work with Sebesh, the Magical Magyars, Puskas, Hidegoti. And then, so this is what this guy was sort of preaching, this doctrine of his football as a British coach, but very much not an Orthodox British coach. And there was other people there. Jesse Carver was in Holland for a time. He coached 3 or 4 clubs in Italy as well. So there's a lot of they were looked on as outliers in British football. Couldn't get a job. Even when Jimmy Hogan went back to the UK, he ended up working, coaching the Aston Villa youth team. And when Hungary came to England, to Wembley in 1953, Jimmy Hogan, the Hungarians were expecting Jimmy Hogan to be a guest of honour. He was there sitting in the stands with a load of Aston Villa kids watching the Hungarians play. But this is how we know the British football orthodoxy didn't appreciate the skills that these guys had. And if they had, total football could have been born in the UK, because all the coaches taught it, or most of the coaches that preached it, were British.
Yeah, that really surprised me, the influence that the British had. I think it was right up to the Ajax, it was right up to the 50s, heading towards the 60s, that they had British coaches.
They very much did. And the guy before Mickles, Vic Buckingham, had 2 spells with Ajax. First spell he won the Eredivisie and got them into the European Cup and gave Cruyff his debut. But he went to Sheffield Wednesday and then got the sack from there and went back to Ajax afterwards. And when he left, Mickles took over. So that was early 60s. Even then, into the early 60s, an English coach was in charge of Ajax.
Yeah, that really shocked me. And the fact that they only turned professional in the 50s and even in the 60s, they were it was only a sort of a kid-on professional that they were doing.
Yeah, it's very much the case. I mean, I always get this backwards. I can never remember which one it was, whether it was Kaiser was either first and Cruyff the second, or it was the other way around. I can't remember. But even when they were professionals, Pete Kaiser, for example, used to own a tobacconist in Amsterdam because he couldn't earn enough money playing football to sort of live on. Cruyff used to work at a sports magazine shop, printing shop, and also worked in a draper store, which is well covered in the workbook of his biography. But these, as you say, they were professionally named, but very much not in the amount of money they were paid. It was only when Mickles came in and wanted to sort of start a bit of a revolution at the club. I wanted him to train twice a day and properly turn and be dedicated. But it can't do this if we're going to pay him peanuts. So it was him who got the club to increase the wages to make them proper professional players, and didn't he get the rewards out of it?
Yeah, I quite laughed at the idea that you mentioned that Mickles brought in cross-country running as well. And I quite laughed at that Cruyff doing a cross-country. I didn't like that, did he?
He didn't like it. No, he didn't like it. It was like at school where, the kid will hang back and wait him to catch up on the second lap and pretend he's done 2 laps with them. And he was never a great fan of the physical exercise, very much training with a ball. That was Cruyff's thing. And but yeah, I mean, that professionalism and the fitness that Mickles demanded from the club was very much the thing that triggered Ajax's success. One thing I've got to mention when we talk about British coaches, perhaps the most influential British coach pre-Mickles was a guy called Jack Reynolds. And Jack Reynolds was spent about 30 years at Ajax in 2 or 3 different spells, and was the father of Ajax, really, the success they had. I spoke to a guy called Menno Pot, who's you probably know Menno Pot over in Netherlands, is an Ajax aficionado, and he's got his own podcast there called Branja. It's called Swagger in English. Is Branja the pronunciation? I think it's called Branja.
Can't help you.
Yeah, I think it's called Branja. Anyway, and he said about because Reynolds he's the guy who sort of developed the system of all teams at the club, be it youth team to the first team and into all intermediates, will all play the same system. They all play the same way. So the graduation through the systems was smooth. And this is what Cruyff took to Barcelona. And to this day, Barcelona still have the same system. That all the lesser teams, the younger teams, play the same system. And Jack Reynolds at the old stadium at Demir had a stand named after him. And now at the Johan Cruyff Arena, as it's called now in Amsterdam, there's the VIP lobby is named after Jack Reynolds, and there's a plaque on the wall in there to this day. They're remembering and Menno says that the Ajax fans still call him Uncle Jack, because of the things he did for them. So yeah, I slipped my mind about the English influence. Jack Reynolds is probably the key guy ahead of Mickles arriving in the early 60s.
Well, I think actually Reynolds had longer as manager of Ajax than Mickles did.
Oh yeah, very much so. I mean, Mickles was only manager for about 7 or 8 years. He left after the 71 European Cup triumph. Whereas, as I say, Jack Reynolds was probably manager there for about 30 years. So very much, in fact, at the time between Ajax turning professional and Mickles arriving, it was about, the numbers were in the book, so you have to forgive me if I'm a bit awry here. There were about 48 years or something like that. And for most of that time, 35 or so of those 40 odd years, Ajax were coached by British coaches. I think it was one Irish guy and a couple of Scots and English guys.
Yeah, I was really astonished to hear that. Do you think that Ajax at that time just took advantage of other teams being unfit, that they got so fit?
Yeah, I think that was the gap that Reynolds closed by because they were quite successful under Reynolds in domestic terms, not in European terms, but in domestic terms. They won a few championships, and Mickles then picked it up and took it on further because they were then becoming the more dominant team. And it was only when Ernst Happel went to Feyenoord afterwards. There's a guy called Jan Peters, I think it was Jan Peters anyway, who'd won. Peters, had won Feyenoord the trophy, the title, but Feyenoord wanted to compete in the European Cup, and I thought Happel was a better proposition. He just because he beat Ajax in the KNVB Cup when he was at Den Bosch. I might be wrong, but it's one of the smaller Dutch teams, one of the smaller Dutch clubs, and he got him the job at Feyenoord. And of course, then Feyenoord went on to do what Mickles had been striving for Ajax for 3 or 4 years after they sort of became the dominant force in Dutch football, and he won the European Cup at his first attempt with Feyenoord.
Yeah, that was a very good one. We enjoyed that one.
I bet you did. I bet there was a few blue, white, and red scarves waving as well.
Yeah. I'm going to. You brought up in your book a story which actually sort of blends in with the Rangers at the moment. And that's a player called Dick Van Dyke. Now, that's probably a lot of people will be laughing at the moment. Dick Van Dyke, did he not play with Lucille Ball in an American soap? But this is honestly true. A player, Dick Van Dyke, was a striker for Twente Sheda at that time.
Yeah.
And there was talk of him moving to Ajax. But Twente didn't let him go, I believe, at that time. And he's just didn't pack in playing, but he just didn't try. Now, we've got the same thing happening with a player called Glenn Kamara at the moment. Kent done that. Ryan Kent done virtually the same, and Morella's done the same, exactly the same for us. They sort of just the last season just stopped playing. Now you've got a theory in your book, and I'll let you tell it because I don't. I won't go through it. I'll let you tell it. You've got a theory in your book of something that could have changed the whole thing of Feyenoord winning, beating Celtic that day, and something else could have happened.
Yeah, it's a weird one. I stumbled on this story from a guy who I know, Dutch football journalist, and he told me the story. And I didn't want to take credit for the story myself, so I quoted him telling me the story. And when he was at Van Dijk was at Twente, I think they were top of the league for a long time, and Ajax moved to sign him, and they agreed to sell him, but he wanted to go straight away, which was about 3 or 4 months from the end of the season. And basically, Twente wanted to obviously try and lock out the league. And the story goes is that he sort of sulked a little bit, and although being very prolific all the way through this season, his sort of goals dried up, and Twente fell away, and Feyenoord won the league and went on to win the European Cup. And if he hadn't have done he'd just pressed on and kept the same form throughout the season, then perhaps that wouldn't have happened. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, I always feel like these things are a bit weird. I mean, you mentioned about Glenn Kamara, and if there's a club want to sign this guy, you're thinking, well, is this the sort of attitude I want? I mean, I remember the guy at Chelsea, Khalid Boulrouz, Dutch defender, and he went to Chelsea and never played, didn't want to know, and you just think, well, if I'm looking at prospective players, is this the sort of character that I'm looking for? Which makes me sort of have doubts of whether the theory about Van Dijk pulling a pug is true. Form comes, form goes, and it's difficult to say with goal scorers because you can score 5 in a game and you can go 6 games without scoring. So I don't know. But Keith Rivers, the coach of Feyenoord, of Twente at the time, I think it was Keith Rivers anyway. In his book, was written by his granddaughter, I think it was certainly of the opinion that was the case, but who can say? But as you say, if things had been different, the outcome of the European Cup that's following season with Feyenoord would have been very different because Feyenoord would have been in it.
Yeah, I'm amazed that you were mentioning the boy from the Dutch guy that played for Chelsea. His name sort of left me just now.
Boulrouz.
Yeah.
Khalid Boulrouz.
Okay, and that was it was on 40,000 a week. I don't know if we're talking about the same one, 40,000 a week. And
I don't know about the money, but it was on a lot of money. We paid a lot of money for him. He played a few games, but not very many. I think he played in the 2010 World Cup one.
I don't know that one. I know he played for only 4 games. Yeah. And it was even he turned up in his bath slippers to training.
I think
sat with a robe on. He's sort of a night robe or morning robe or whatever you want to call it, and his bath slippers, and just sat and watched the training because he just said, "Well, they won't let me train." So that was it.
Yeah,
he ended up getting millions, and that he said that as well. Because I read a piece about him not so long ago, and he said, "Why should I have left? They had promised me that money. Why should I have left?" And it was at the time they didn't have a lot of money either because the Russian guy wasn't involved at that time either. So they were just off their own money. Anyway, I'll move back onto your own book. Now, I was going to try and sort of give you a question that you didn't have in your book, but then I kept reading and kept reading, and there was a point I was going to have popped up in your book, and it's a reporter called Johan Derksen. Now, he's been a sort of a bad guy with Rangers as well because he's had a few run-ins with Rangers saying things that Rangers supporters didn't like. And he has got a story that it supposedly got from Van Hanegem. And the story goes that for the Dutch team it was mostly, that Michels came into the dressing room and he would say, "Okay, guys, here's the way we're going to play today. We'll go here, we'll play these tactics, we'll do this tactics, we'll do this, and we'll do that." and then he would walk out the door again, and Johan Cruyff and Van Hanegem would turn around and say, "Listen, guys, just forget what he's saying. We'll do it this way." And that's the way. So it was actually Cruyff that was and Van Hanegem that was running the show.
It's a classic story. I don't know about the Dutch one. I didn't know about that one, but certainly with Ajax, Pete Keizer said very much the same thing. That Michels would say, "Yeah, we're going to do this and this and that and the other." And it said as soon as Michels wore out, Cruyff said, "Stuff, forget that. This is what we're going to do." Now, Cruyff always said that Michels runs the team off the pitch and I run the team on the pitch. And so it wasn't sort of shy about saying, that's he on the field of play, his call was what counted. And I didn't know about the Van Hanegem and the Dutch thing, but it certainly rings true because Keizer said very much the same thing about when they were playing for Ajax.
Yeah. One of the things as well is the Dutch coach Kovac, is it? I think you call him.
Kovac, he's Romanian.
Yeah. The amount of smoking he did, you sort of keep bringing it up in the book. I don't think you would get away with that these days. The amount of smoking, the cigarettes, and
yeah. Well, I mean that was seen as quite sort of normal in those days. Of course, I mean Cruyff was a serial cigarette smoker, and eventually lung cancer sort of killed him, and it was sort of very much deemed part of the furniture in those days. And when Kovac took over, because Michels was very much a disciplinarian, ex sort of school teacher, at that sort of, they used to call him the Bull. It was very sort of dogmatic, and lots of players said different things about him. I remember a piece of Barry Hulsoff had said that you go out to the restaurant with him and he'd be fine. And go out afterwards on the following day, the pitch, and he'd be calling you everything. Pete Keizer hated him as well. Pete Keizer, apparently, when Michels left in 1971 at the European Cup final, got on a table and danced when he heard the news that Michels was leaving. But Kovac was an entirely different character, very much the sort of anti-Michels, as it were, not just player at all. Let the players have a lot more latitude, and they played so much with more freedom after Michels left under Kovac. And Cruyff says it's quoted in Jonathan Wilson's book, I think it's in Inverted Triangle, that they played better football under Kovac, and I think that's undoubtedly the case. Kovac had he almost took the handbrake off. Took the reins off and let them run free. Away you go, guys. Let's run free, enjoy yourselves. And they were such a talented team that's what they did. And in the end, that's when you're sort of running downhill full speed without any brakes. Eventually, you're going to hit a wall, and that's what happened after '73 when Kovac left, and there was nobody there to sort of pick up the tab afterwards. The guy who took over, George Schnabel, was. So you talk about needing big feet for big shoes. This guy had hardly got any feet at all.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. That freedom that they got, was that actually the beginning of the end? That they started fighting amongst themselves.
Yeah, it was very much the case, and Cruyff afterwards said that because Kovac wasn't really into disciplining players, he had to do it, and he was sort of becoming looked upon as the bad guy in the team. Now, that's Cruyff saying what Cruyff says, justifying his son. So, because nobody ever told Cruyff he had to be in charge. That was always his God-given role, that he was always going to be the leader. But the freedom they gave them was, they were magnificent. Those they're great under Michels, but even better for the next 2 years under Kovac. But that freedom eventually was their downfall. Obviously, when Cruyff left after '73, that was a major catastrophe as well. But if Ajax had invested the money they had a world record fee for Cruyff. But they didn't buy anybody. They signed Jan Mulder, who had been playing at Anderlecht, I think he'd been playing at. But he was such a injury-prone player that he didn't play the amount of games that to make a really competitive difference. And I remember when I spoke to Ruud Krol about this, he said, it felt like the first brick out of the wall, it was going to collapse afterwards, and Cruyff left, because they'd never invested the money to buy anybody else to replace him. And players fell away afterwards. Barry Hulsoff had that terrible knee injury, and players sort of drifted away, and it sort of Spark retired, and it just fell away. And They were so great. What made them great? There's a guy called Stephen Scraggy, who is a colleague of mine at these Football Times, and he wrote a piece for the Legacy for me in the book, and there's a great line you got in there, is that the only team that could defeat Ajax was Ajax, and they did.
Yeah. Jan Mulder, I think he's actually made more money out of television than they would ever made on the football field, because he was up until recently one of the sort of the biggest pundits on the television. And the other name I mentioned, Johan Dirksen, he has just signed a millions contract for he does a TV show now. Started off as a football show, and now it's even moved on to politics, and so he's one of the biggest, richest paid people on television in Holland at the moment. I've got another. Do you think in this modern day modern total football, could Cruyff, smoking as many as he did a day, have kept up with the players that are around today?
No.
This high intensity.
No. This is your short answer, but I don't think any player nowadays would be allowed to smell how Cruyff used to smell. It's always a fascinating question looking across years, and people say, well, would the Ajax team of 70s be competitive? And 50 years down there, because it's 50 years. 2023 is 50 years after their third trophy, which was in 1973. And to my, I always say the answer is yes. If they have the same training, same coaching, then yes. You look at the pitches they played on in those days. You see play. Mud around the ankles. They still played wonderful football. So you can play on those pitches, you can play on anything. So yeah, the talent was there, and it is transferable. But the fitness levels, even after Mikkels worked to enhance the situation, was nothing like it is today. Nothing, not even close. These are like thoroughbred athletes today, the top footballers in the world today. So that's the massive major difference. You put them on the pitch now against a modern team and they get slaughtered purely because of fitness. But if they had that same fitness regime, same coaching regime, same opportunity to sort of concentrate on the game more, they would certainly be competitive for sure.
Yeah, the thing is, would they have got the time that they had then? Would they have got that time on the ball today? So that's a sort of a.
It's interesting, I was interviewed by a guy in the Daily Mail over here just before the European Cup final, and he wanted to know about the links between Ajax, Cruyff, and Pep Guardiola, because Guardiola played under Cruyff at Barcelona and as part of Cruyff's dream team. And you look at the sort of like a family tree almost going on from Ajax and Mikkels and Kovacs and through Cruyff, Guardiola, and then even Guardiola beyond that. You've got people like Vincent Kompany, Koeman, also played under Cruyff. So you've got that coaching tree still goes. So the thing with total football is it's not a thing that you can put in a box and close the box. Over the years, over the 10s, 20s, 30, 40, 50 years, the decades since it started being played, it's developed. So it's certainly arguable that the Manchester City team under Guardiola, and perhaps Liverpool under Klopp to some extent as well, play a kind of total football that you can see the DNA from the Ajax teams in the 70s. And it's probably one of the few doctrines in football, one of the few tactical innovations that has sort of persisted and grown, and not persisted, it's flourished and blossomed and developed as the years have gone by.
Yeah, well, even now the Ajax Academy is sort of noted as one of the best in the world. I've got to go on to Rangers.
Okay.
For a minute.
Okay.
The Super Cup, 1973, yes. January 1973. I was at the first game at Ibrox.
Wow.
I just absolutely come away in awe of the players that day, especially Cruyff. Cruyff ran that game. And yeah, I was looking at the Rangers team that day. I'll say it out because a lot of obviously the listeners will be Rangers supporters. It was McCloy, Jardine, Derek Johnson, Dave Smith, Willie Matheson, John Gregg, Tom Forsyth, Alec MacDonald, Alfie Conn, Harlane, and Quinton Young. I was actually surprised that Quinton Young was playing because it was normally I would expect normally Willie Johnson to be there.
Sure.
For me, it was a sort of a really defensive team. It was more a Rangers team that were going out to stop the Dutch football than going to actually try to beat them.
Yeah. It's a fascinating period. This is because the idea of Super Cup, so the European Cup winners playing the Cup winners, came about. I think it was the Dutch guy who approached UEFA. The UEFA wanted to do it, but the problem was that Rangers were under a ban from UEFA sanctioned games for 1 year because of some crowd trouble. So they couldn't actually play that game as a European Super Cup game. So they played it to celebrate Rangers' centenary. So, although it was a first unofficial Super, it didn't have that badge until the following year. But to go to the game itself, it was quite a sort of a defensive setup for Rangers. But in the second game in Amsterdam, Rangers gave Ajax. I mean, I remember writing this in the book. I read reports and spoke to a couple of guys who had been at the game. And Rangers really gave Ajax a difficult game in Amsterdam. They were proper determined not to sort of, go. But they were going to go out of the shields. They weren't going to sort of die in the hole. They proper gave everything they got, and they played really well in Amsterdam. Probably better than they played at Ajax, perhaps because the pressure was off, and they had a bit less to lose, shall we say. And they played really well. And I say they gave. I can't remember who it was who scored a cracking first goal from outside the area. I can't remember which player it was now. But to go one of
McDonald scored, and who was the other one that scored? I'm trying to think. I think it was Parlin. Was it Parlin? Was it a winger?
The winger scored it, throwing in the counter for the post, and he scored a header. But the first goal was a brilliant shot. And as I say, that Rangers gave Ajax all the game they could possibly want.
Yeah, the Rangers supporters will be shitting, screaming at me now, saying you should know that. Anyway, the Dutch team that day was Stoy, Schuurbier, Blankenburg, Hulshoff, Troll, Han, Arno Muren, Gerry Moorwin, Rep, Krauf, and Kaiser.
That ain't bad team.
That was a great team. See, the other thing I was going to ask you about, and I'm going to dim my camera for a minute to put on a light, but I will be listening. The other question I was going to ask you, nowadays we've got 5 substitutes. In the days we only had 2. Will that help in total football, do you think? Will we get real total football?
That's a really good question, mate. That's a really good question. I think that the demands of total football are so the fitness, the ability to change positions, to cover for players, to sink deeper and sort of play in different ways. It's quite exhausting. And I remember I spoke to Rick Kroll about the 1973 final, and was playing Belgrade against Juventus. Rep scored a goal in about 5 minutes, and the rest of the game was very sort of walking pace, very much the case. And he said that it's because it was so hot, and the Dutch weren't used to it. And it's playing top football is quite physically demanding. So yeah, I think if you had, especially if you had the talent and the talented players, because both under Mikkels and under Kovacs, there was a very tight squad of regular players. Perhaps 12, 13 players. And there was other players who came and played 1 or 2 games, perhaps 3 games across a season in competitive games, because they played a lot of friendlies in those days to raise money. But yeah, I think it would have made a difference if they had the talent. But I suppose I didn't have that drive to have a larger squad because there wasn't that need, because they were only playing with 2 subs anyway. But it's a good point. I think it would make a difference. Yeah, it would help, because you could... there's a famous occasion in the 1970 World Cup final. Well, not it's 1970 World Cup finals, when Italy had the two players who were both sort of competing for the number 10 role. Was Gianni Rivera, who played for Inter. Played for Milan, and he just won the Ballon d'Or. And there was Capello who played for not Capello. To come back to me a second. Sorry, the random Mazzola, who played for Inter, and they both played the same sort of game. And the coach decided that he would play, because he had the ability for the substitutions, to play Mazzola in the first half. Run yourself ragged, son. You're coming off at half time, and play Rivera on the second half, and more attacking player when players were sort of tiring. So there's a guy who used that substitution to keep this sort of thing on. So I think you're probably right. It's a good call, mate.
Yeah, I've got a question now. It's not to do with. It's more to do with the Dutch team, 1974. Cruyff refused to go. Would Holland have won it with Cruyff in the team?
You mean 78? You refused to go in 78?
Oh, was it 78? Sorry, when they played Argentina.
That's okay. It did. It was an interesting situation. There was a guy. You probably be aware of the reason they didn't go. He was playing at Barcelona at the time, and he had his house was attacked, attempted kidnapping, and he refused to go afterwards. It would have made a difference. There's no doubt about that. It would have made a difference. The question is, would he have made the difference? Because the players, they had to play a different way. And Happel was sort of coaching there. But in the background was this simmering sort of problem with a guy called Jans Vodkruis, who had taken the team over and actually got them qualified for the tournament. And he'd been sort of sidelined, and there was a little bit of friction between the two. And Vodkruis wanted Rensenbrink to play in the Cruyff role. Well, Rensenbrink, Cruyff was, you couldn't have a bigger ego than Cruyff if you tried, But Rensenbrink was a very different player, much more understated, and he didn't really want to do it. And so they played a non-Cruyff system. So it was a different team in 78. The 78 team was probably not as good as the team in 74. And yet, strange enough, they came closer. 74 was a generational team. They still had some great players. The problem when Cruyff didn't go, because the other player who wouldn't go, was Van Hanegem. He ducked out as well. And Van Hanegem played for Happel at Feyenoord. So he was like Mikkels was to Cruyff, Van Hanegem was to Happel. And he didn't go for a really weird reason. I say weird reason. He was a massive man of principle, Van Hanegem. In 74, all the bonuses from commercial activities that the team earned went into a pot, and everybody got an equal share, whether you were the star player or you were the guy who cleaned the boots. All got a share of it. In 78, some of the players didn't want to do it, and Van Hanegem kicked off about it and said, this isn't the way we do things. And he made the statement that if the guy who cleans my boots don't turn up, I've got to clean them myself. So why shouldn't he get a cut? But some of the players wanted to go their own way, and so he backed out. So they weren't only short of Cruyff, they were short of Van Hanegem as well. So the two massive creative players in the middle of the park were absent. If they both would have gone, I think it would have made a difference. Yeah, because they said, let's go back to the fun analysis. They were that far, quarter of an inch from winning the World Cup when Rensenbrink hit the post in the last minute.
Yeah. Well, I think with Cruyff and Van Hanegem, I think they probably would have won it. I've always thought that, not just because I'm hearing it now.
Yeah.
I think I've virtually went through everything that I've sort of. I said half an hour to 45 minutes. So that's that we went past that. I've really enjoyed your knowledge. I take my hat off to your knowledge, and I thoroughly enjoyed the book.
Thank you.
I would. Do you know what the book brought to me actually? See, when I was reading it, I wanted to use the facts to go onto YouTube and actually dig up what you had found out and watch it, and that's what sort of plus all the small bits of the boy from Twente, Dick van Dijk from Twente, and Another one thing that I really enjoyed was why Johan Cruyff played with number 14. I thought
Oh,
that was
do you know, Dave? This is a brilliant story, and it's one of those things where you read and you think, I just hope that's true. And I'll tell the story. I'll just tell the story briefly.
yeah, on you go. Yeah.
Well, Cruyff had been injured for a while, and Cruyff used to play away number 9, and while Cruyff was away, Jerry Muren wore number 9. And when he came back into the team after the injury, he was out for a number of weeks. Muren handed him the shirt, number 9 shirt, back, and said, "No, this is yours." And Cruyff said, "No, you can wear it. I'll wear something else." And he dipped his hand into a pile of shirts on the table and picked one out, and it was number 14. And he wore that shirt that day, and has ever since. And it was always a story. I hope it's true. And I managed to talk to Orc Cock a while ago, where he wrote Crow's biography, and I asked him about it. I said, tell me, Orc, and he says it's a true story. And he spoke to people who were there at the time, and it is definitely a true story. How Cruyff got number 14. It's a brilliant little story, and I was so delighted. If Orchid had said, "Nah, it's only a legend, it's not true," I'd been so disappointed. But it's a great story. So yeah, that's how Cruyff got number 14, and was always known as the Eternal 14.
Yeah, I think he actually said later that numbers don't mean anything to him. It's the way you play football.
The only numbers that meant anything to Johan Cruyff were his wages, his salary, his money. That's somebody else who said to me, Cruyff never worried about numbers. He wasn't interested except for his payments.
Yeah, well, in the early days, he wouldn't have made much selling magazines on the street, so he couldn't have been earning much as a football player. Anyway, I'll give you. I don't know whether there's anything you want to add. I'll also give you the chance to tell us where we can get in touch with you, where they can order your books, or who and what and why.
Okay, well, firstly, I'll just say thanks, mate. It's been great. And time flies when you talk about football. It's been a wonderful chat, so thank you for that. The book, it's called Dutch Masters, How Ajax's Total Football Conquered Europe. It's available on Amazon. You can find it by just typing my name in. That's Gary Thacker, Gary Thacker. You can also get me on Twitter. I'm on Twitter at all_blue_days. That's DAZE. And I've got links to all my different books on there as well. So anybody wants to jump on Twitter, give me a follow. I always follow back. So then you'll see the things I'm talking about Dutch football and many other aspects of the game. So yeah, thanks for that, mate.
Yeah, no problem. It's great having you on. I'm going to be honest with you, it's the first time I've done an interview like this, so I was really nervous, and I was thinking, I hope I can last 20 minutes. But obviously, you get talking, then things become easier, and it's great talking about football.
So you're right, mate. We had a podcast we do just like talking down about football down the pub with your mates over a couple of pints. Well, what could be better?
Yeah, that's it. That's the way the gallant few are as well. We're just mates that love talking about Rangers, where you talk about football in general. And as I say, your knowledge of football is absolutely tremendous. I can't remember even few things. Never mind the amount you've got in your head. You must have a tape recorder or something in there.
Yeah, years of practice, mate. Years of practice and copious notes.
Yeah, and reading books. I think you must be a big reader of books.
Yeah. Yeah, very much so.
Well, thanks for coming on, and I'm going to finish off now. Obviously, I've thoroughly enjoyed this interview, and hope that you'll go out and buy the book because it's worth reading. And as I said, it's not just the reading, but you can get ideas to have a look at some of the things that are in the book, because there's absolutely some brilliant films that I watched that Gary had put down in the book. So please go out and buy it, and I'll see you. I believe we're on Sunday, but I don't think I'm on. So we'll see you whenever I'm bound again. Bye.